Long before airplanes crossed the skies, long before railways connected cities, there was only one path that truly connected the world: the sea. Kadal Vanigam maritime trade was not just about goods. It was about courage, discovery, power, and survival. But this journey did not begin with empires. It began with something much simpler: curiosity. Early humans lived near rivers and coastlines. They watched the endless sea and wondered what lay beyond the horizon. But curiosity alone was not enough, therefore they began to experiment. At first, they used simple wooden logs tied together. These were not ships. They were fragile, unstable, and dangerous. But they floated, and that was enough to begin. Fishermen were the first explorers of the sea. They did not sail to conquer lands but to survive. They went a little farther each day. They learned how waves moved, how winds changed direction, how the sky could warn them of danger. But the sea was not kind. Storms destroyed boats. Strong currents pulled them away from land. Many never returned, therefore fear became their first teacher. Over time, humans began to understand something important. The sea was dangerous, yes, but it was also a path to new lands. A path to new people, a path to new opportunities, and slowly trade began. In ancient times, different regions had different resources. Some lands had spices, some had gold, some had silk. Some had rare stones, but no place had everything. Therefore, people needed each other. At first, trade happened by land. Caravans moved slowly across deserts and mountains. But this method had a problem: it was too slow, too expensive, and too dangerous. Robbers attacked caravans, animals died on long journeys, and goods often got damaged. But the sea offered a solution. A single boat could carry what hundreds of animals could not. It could travel faster than caravans, and it could connect distant lands directly. Therefore, maritime trade began to grow. One of the earliest civilizations to master sea trade was the Indus Valley Civilization. They built ports like Lothal. They created docks where ships could safely anchor. But they did not just build structures, they built systems. They developed weights and measures for trade. They created seals to mark goods. They established trust in transactions. But trade required more than systems, it required connection. Therefore, they traded with distant lands like Mesopotamia. Ships carried beads, cotton textiles, and precious stones, and in return they brought back metals and other valuable goods. At the same time, another civilization was rising in the West: the ancient Egyptians. They used the Nile River as their main trade route, but they also moved into the Red Sea. They built strong wooden ships. They sailed to places like Punt to bring back gold, incense, and exotic animals, but sea travel was still risky. They did not have maps as we know them today. They did not have compasses, therefore they depended on nature. They followed the stars, they watched bird movements, they understood seasonal winds. But even with all this knowledge, the sea remained unpredictable. As time passed, maritime trade began to expand further. The Phoenicians became masters of the sea. They were not a large empire, but they were powerful traders. They built advanced ships with strong hulls. They created trade networks across the Mediterranean. But they did not just trade goods, they traded ideas. They spread writing systems, they shared knowledge between cultures. Therefore, maritime trade became more than economics, it became cultural exchange. Meanwhile, in the Indian subcontinent, coastal trade began to flourish. Regions in South India, especially the Tamil kingdoms, started using the sea actively. The Chola Empire would later become one of the greatest naval powers. But even before their peak, the foundation was already forming. Fishermen turned into traders. Small boats turned into large ships. Local trade turned into international exchange. But something even more powerful was about to change everything: the discovery of monsoon winds. Sailors realized something remarkable. The winds over the Indian Ocean were not random. They followed a pattern. For part of the year, winds blew in one direction, and for the rest, they reversed. Therefore, sailors could plan their journeys. They could sail to distant lands with one wind and return home with another. This discovery transformed maritime trade. Routes between India, Arabia, and Africa became faster and safer. But with growth came competition. Different regions wanted control over trade routes. They wanted power, wealth, and influence, and this created tension. By now, Kadal Vanigam was no longer small-scale trade. It had become a global network. Ships carried spices from India, silk from China, gold from Africa, wine from Europe. But this growth came with a question: who would control the seas? Because whoever controlled the sea controlled trade, and whoever controlled trade controlled wealth. But the sea does not give power easily. Storms still destroyed fleets. Pirates attacked merchant ships. Navigational errors led to disaster. Therefore, only the strongest and smartest survived. Maritime trade was not just about business, it was about bravery. Every journey was a risk, every voyage could be the last, but still they sailed, because the rewards were too great to ignore. As part 1 comes to an end, one thing becomes clear: Kadal Vanigam did not start as an empire's strategy. It started as human curiosity, but it slowly turned into a battle for power. And in the next part, we will see how great empires rise, how massive trade routes form, and how the sea becomes a battlefield for dominance. Rise of empires and Indian Ocean trade. The sea was no longer just a path, it had become a prize. In part 1, humans learned how to sail, they discovered winds, they began exchanging goods, but now something had changed. Trade was no longer about survival, it was about power. As maritime routes expanded, certain regions began to dominate. Among them, one region stood at the center of global trade: the Indian Ocean. It connected East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, Southeast Asia, and even China. But this was not just geography, it was opportunity. Indian merchants played a crucial role in this growing network. Spices like pepper, cardamom, and cinnamon became highly valuable. Textiles from India were in huge demand. Precious stones and pearls attracted distant traders, but demand alone was not enough. Therefore, organized trade systems emerged. Ports became cities, markets became institutions. Trade became structured. One of the most powerful forces behind this expansion was the Maurya Empire. Under rulers like Ashoka, roads and trade networks were strengthened. But the Mauryas focused more on land trade. Therefore, maritime power shifted south. In South India, something extraordinary was happening. The Tamil kingdoms Chera, Chola, and Pandya were rising. Among them, the Chola Empire would later dominate the seas. But their strength did not appear overnight, it was built step by step. Ports like Kavaripattinam became major trade centers. Ships arrived from distant lands. Merchants spoke different languages, but trade was not just about goods, it was about relationships. Tamil merchants formed strong connections with traders from Rome, Arabia, and Southeast Asia. And this leads us to one of the most fascinating parts of maritime history: the connection between India and Rome. The Roman Empire had a growing appetite for luxury goods. They wanted spices, they wanted silk, they wanted exotic products from the East, but there was a problem: Rome was far away. Therefore, maritime trade became essential. Roman ships began sailing through the Red Sea. They reached Indian ports like Muziris. Gold flowed into India, spices flowed into Rome. But this trade created imbalance. Rome was spending too much gold. And yet they could not stop, because demand kept growing. Meanwhile, Arab traders began to rise in importance. They were not just middlemen, they became masters of navigation. They understood the monsoon winds deeply. They built strong ships known as dhows. They connected Africa, India, and the Middle East. But their true strength was something else: consistency. They sailed regularly, they maintained routes, they built trust. Therefore, they became the backbone of Indian Ocean trade. Further east, another giant was awakening: China. During the time of the Han Dynasty, trade began expanding outward. Silk became one of the most desired goods in the world. Chinese ceramics and technologies attracted global attention, but China faced a challenge: land routes like the Silk Road were dangerous. Therefore, maritime routes became important. Chinese ships began entering the Indian Ocean. They connected with Southeast Asia, India, and beyond. But China was not just trading goods, they were spreading culture. Ideas, inventions, and traditions traveled with merchants. As all these powers grew, the Indian Ocean became the center of global trade. But this system had a unique feature. Unlike later colonial systems, it was cooperative. Different regions participated, no single empire controlled everything. But this balance would not last forever. Because wherever there is wealth, there is competition. The Chola Empire eventually rose to unmatched naval strength. Under rulers like Rajaraja Chola I and Rajendra Chola I, they did something no Indian kingdom had done before. They built a powerful navy. But why? Because trade routes needed protection. Pirates threatened ships. Rival kingdoms tried to block access. Therefore, control became necessary. The Cholas launched naval expeditions across Southeast Asia. They attacked regions like Srivijaya. But this was not random war, it was strategic. They wanted control over trade routes. And for a time they succeeded. Tamil influence spread across the seas. Temples, language, and culture traveled with merchants. Indian ideas reached Indonesia, Malaysia, and beyond. But even powerful empires face limits. Maintaining naval dominance was difficult. Trade networks were vast, and slowly new powers began to rise. In the West, Islamic empires expanded. They controlled key ports and trade routes. Cities like Baghdad became centers of commerce. But their strength was not just military, it was economic. Trade under Islamic rule flourished. Scholars, merchants, and travelers moved freely. Knowledge spread along with goods. And one famous traveler would later document this world, Ibn Battuta. He described bustling ports, diverse cultures, and thriving trade networks. But even this golden age had a weakness. It depended on balance. As long as no single power dominated completely, trade remained open. But the world was changing. New technologies were emerging. New ambitions were forming, and somewhere far in the West, a different kind of power was rising. Europe had been watching all along. They saw the wealth flowing through the Indian Ocean. They saw spices, silk, and gold changing hands, but they were not part of this system, and that was a problem. Land routes were controlled by others. Sea routes were dominated by Arab and Indian traders. Therefore, Europe began searching for a new path, a direct route to the riches of the East, but finding such a route was not easy. The oceans beyond were unknown, maps were incomplete, dangers were everywhere, but ambition is stronger than fear. As Part 2 ends, the stage is set for a major transformation. The Indian Ocean trade network is thriving, empires are rising and falling, connections are stronger than ever, but something is coming. A shift that will break the balance. A shift that will turn trade into conquest. European arrival and age of exploration, the balance of the seas was about to break. For centuries, the Indian Ocean had been a shared space. Arab traders, Indian merchants, Southeast Asian kingdoms, Chinese fleets, all connected by trade. But far away in Europe, a different mindset was growing. They did not just want to trade, they wanted control. Europe had a problem. Spices like pepper, cloves, and cinnamon were in huge demand. But these goods passed through many hands before reaching Europe. Arab traders controlled key routes. Ottoman powers dominated land connections. Therefore, prices became extremely high. Europe wanted a direct route to India, but there was a challenge. They did not know how. This challenge led to one of the most important periods in history, the Age of Exploration. European nations like Portugal and Spain began investing in sea voyages. They built stronger ships, they improved navigation techniques, they studied winds and currents. But technology alone was not enough, they needed courage. One of the earliest explorers was Christopher Columbus. He believed he could reach India by sailing west, but he made a mistake. Instead of India, he reached the Americas, but even mistakes can change history. His journey proved something important: long-distance ocean travel was possible. But the real breakthrough came from another explorer, Vasco da Gama. In 1498, he did what Europe had been trying to do for decades. He sailed around Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and reached India, specifically Calicut, Kozhikode. This moment changed everything. For the first time, Europe had direct access to Indian Ocean trade, but this was not just a trade mission. It was the beginning of domination. Unlike Arab and Indian traders, the Portuguese had a different approach. They did not believe in shared trade systems. They believed in control through force. They built forts along the coast. They captured key ports. They attacked rival ships. But why such aggression? Because they understood one thing: control the sea, control the wealth. The Portuguese established strongholds in places like Goa. They created a naval system to monitor trade routes. Ships needed permission to sail, and those who refused were destroyed. But their rise was not uncontested. Arab traders resisted. Indian kingdoms pushed back. Local powers challenged their authority, but the Portuguese had an advantage: advanced naval weapons. Cannons mounted on ships changed warfare at sea. Battles were no longer just about boarding ships, they became long-distance attacks. This gave Europeans a powerful edge. Meanwhile, other European nations were watching. Spain, Netherlands, England, France. They saw Portugal's success, and they wanted a share, therefore competition intensified. The Dutch East India Company emerged as a major power. They focused heavily on Southeast Asia. Spices like nutmeg and cloves were extremely valuable. But instead of just trading, they controlled production. They captured islands. They forced local populations to work under them. They limited supply to increase prices. Trade had now become exploitation. Soon after, another giant entered the scene, the British East India Company. At first, they came as traders. They requested permission from Indian rulers. They set up small trading posts, but their intentions were deeper. They were patient. They slowly expanded their influence. They built alliances. They interfered in local politics. They used both diplomacy and force, but their real strength was strategy. Unlike the Portuguese, they did not rely only on naval power, they combined trade with territorial control. And step by step, they began to dominate India. Meanwhile, the French also entered the race. The French East India Company tried to compete, but conflicts between European powers increased. Battles were no longer just local, they became global. Wars in Europe affected trade in Asia. Colonies became battlegrounds, and maritime trade turned into a system of empire building. But something important was changing the spirit of Kadal Vanigam. Earlier, trade was about exchange, different cultures interacted, goods flowed freely, knowledge spread naturally. But now trade was controlled. Access was restricted, routes were guarded, power decided who could trade. The Indian Ocean was no longer open, it had become a contested zone. Yet despite European dominance, local traders did not disappear. Arab merchants continued sailing, Indian traders adapted to new systems, Asian networks survived. But they had to operate under new rules, and those rules were not fair. By now, maritime trade had reached a new phase. It was no longer just about goods, it was about empire. Ships did not just carry spices, they carried soldiers, they carried weapons, they carried ambition. And this ambition would lead to something even darker, the rise of global colonial systems. The exploitation of resources, the movement of enslaved people, the reshaping of entire continents. As Part 3 ends, the world stands transformed. Europe has entered the Indian Ocean. Trade routes are under control, competition is fierce, but this is only the beginning. The oceans were no longer free. They were controlled, divided, and guarded by empires. What began as simple trade had now become a system of domination. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European powers had tightened their grip on maritime trade. The Portuguese had started it, the Dutch had expanded it, but now one power was rising above all: Britain. The British East India Company was no longer just a company. It had become a political and military force. It controlled ports, collected taxes, maintained armies, but most importantly, it controlled trade. India became one of the most important centers in this system. Spices, cotton, indigo, and silk flowed out of Indian ports, but this was not equal exchange, it was extraction. Raw materials were taken from India, sent to Britain, manufactured into finished goods, and then sold back to India. But this system had a purpose: to benefit the empire. Traditional Indian industries began to suffer. Local weavers lost their livelihoods. Artisans could not compete with machine-made goods, but resistance was difficult. Because control was not just economic, it was military. Meanwhile, maritime trade expanded across the world. The Atlantic Ocean became just as important as the Indian Ocean. And this led to one of the most tragic systems in human history: the triangular trade. This system connected three regions: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Goods moved in one direction, but something far more terrible moved in another: human beings. The transatlantic slave trade became a central part of global maritime trade. Millions of Africans were captured, forced onto ships, and transported across the ocean. The journey was brutal, ships were overcrowded, conditions were inhuman, many did not survive. But why did this happen? Because colonial economies needed labor. Plantations in the Americas required workers, and slavery became the system that supported it. Ships that once carried spices and silk now carried suffering. Meanwhile, in Asia, colonial powers continued to expand their influence. The Dutch East India Company controlled Spice Islands. The French East India Company competed for territories, but ultimately, Britain gained the upper hand. After key conflicts, including the Battle of Plassey, British control in India became stronger. And with that, control over maritime trade increased. Ports like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta became major hubs. Ships arrived and departed regularly. But these ports were no longer just trade centers, they were colonial gateways. Goods flowed out in massive quantities. Cotton went to British factories, tea became a global commodity. Opium was traded to China, but this trade had consequences. In China, the opium trade created addiction and instability. When Chinese authorities tried to stop it, conflict erupted, leading to events like the First Opium War. This shows something important: maritime trade was no longer peaceful, it was enforced. Navies protected trade routes. Warships accompanied merchant vessels. Empires used force to open markets, but alongside power and conflict, there was also innovation. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Steam engines replaced wind power. Ships no longer depended entirely on monsoon winds. They became faster, stronger, more reliable. The introduction of steamships transformed Kadal Vanigam. Travel time reduced significantly, routes became more predictable, but speed also increased competition. Another major development was the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. This canal connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It created a shorter route between Europe and Asia. Ships no longer needed to go around Africa. Therefore, trade became even faster. But control of the canal became crucial, because whoever controlled it controlled global trade routes. Meanwhile, communication improved. The invention of the telegraph allowed faster exchange of information. Trade decisions could be made quickly. Markets became interconnected. By the 19th century, maritime trade had become truly global. Goods moved across continents regularly, but this system had a hidden cost. Colonies were exploited, local economies were reshaped. Cultures were disrupted, wealth flowed toward imperial centers, and inequality increased. Yet resistance began to grow. People in colonized regions started questioning foreign control. Movements for independence slowly emerged. In India, voices began to rise against British rule. Economic exploitation became a major issue. Trade, once a source of prosperity, had become a tool of control. As Part 4 comes to an end, the world is deeply connected through maritime trade, but it is also deeply divided. Empires dominate the seas, colonies supply resources, and global systems shape everyday life. But change is coming, because no system of control lasts forever. Empires rise and empires fall. But the sea remains. By the early 20th century, the world had changed dramatically. Colonial powers still controlled vast regions, but cracks had begun to appear. Wars, resistance movements, economic shifts all began to weaken imperial dominance. But the biggest shock came through two global events, World War I and World War II. These wars were not just fought on land, they were fought at sea. Navies clashed for control of shipping routes. Submarines attacked merchant vessels. Supply chains were disrupted. But something important became clear: maritime trade was essential for survival. Countries depended on ships for food, fuel, weapons, and communication. Without control of the sea, nations could collapse. After World War II ended, the world entered a new phase. Empires weakened, colonies demanded independence. And slowly, freedom movements succeeded. India gained independence in 1947. Many Asian and African nations followed. But political freedom brought a new challenge: economic rebuilding. New nations needed trade to grow. They needed to export goods, import technology, connect with the world. And once again, the sea became central. But this time, the system would be different. Colonial control was gone. Instead of empires, nations became participants in global trade. International organizations began to form. One of the most important was the International Maritime Organization. Its goal was simple: to make shipping safer, more efficient, and more regulated. Because maritime trade had become too important to fail. Meanwhile, technology began transforming everything. The biggest revolution came in the form of containerization. Before this, goods were loaded individually. It took time, it caused delays, it increased costs, but then came standardized containers, metal boxes that could carry anything. This innovation was popularized by Malcolm McLean. With containers, loading became faster, transport became safer, costs dropped significantly, and this changed global trade forever. Ships grew larger, ports became more advanced, and maritime trade entered a new era. Today, massive container ships cross the oceans daily. They carry electronics, clothing, food, machinery. Almost everything we use has traveled by sea. In fact, more than 80% of global trade by volume happens through maritime routes. That is the power of Kadal Vanigam today. Major shipping routes connect the world. The Suez Canal still plays a crucial role. The Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific. These narrow passages control global movement, and even a small disruption can affect the entire world. Modern ports have become economic engines. Cities like Singapore, Shanghai, and Dubai thrive on maritime trade. India too has major ports like Mumbai, Chennai, and Kochi, but competition is intense. Efficiency matters, speed matters. Technology matters, but with progress comes new challenges. Environmental concerns are growing. Oil spills damage marine life, ship emissions contribute to pollution. Climate change affects sea routes. Therefore, the industry is evolving again. Green shipping technologies are being developed. Cleaner fuels, energy-efficient ships, sustainable practices. The goal is clear: to protect the oceans while using them. Another challenge is security. Piracy still exists in some regions. Geopolitical tensions affect trade routes. Nations invest heavily in naval protection, because even today, control of the sea still means power, but something has changed from the past. Unlike colonial times, today's maritime trade is more interconnected. Countries depend on each other. Supply chains are global. A product made in one country, assembled in another, sold in a third, all connected through the sea. Digital technology has also entered the picture. Tracking systems monitor ships in real time. AI helps optimize routes. Automation speeds up port operations. Kadal Vanigam has become smarter, faster, more efficient, more complex, and yet at its core it is still the same. A journey across water, a connection between lands, a story of exchange. From wooden logs to massive steel ships, from local fishing trips to global supply chains, the evolution has been extraordinary, but the spirit remains unchanged: curiosity. The same curiosity that made early humans look at the horizon still drives global trade today. As this story ends, one truth stands clear: Kadal Vanigam is not just history. It is the lifeline of the modern world. Every product you use, every device you hold, every item you wear has a journey behind it. A journey across oceans. And somewhere right now a ship is sailing, carrying the future across the sea.